In the spring of 1992, on a stretch of land just north of San Diego, California, a routine highway expansion project was about to deliver something no one had bargained for. Construction crews were carving through layers of ancient sediment when an alert backhoe operator noticed something strange surfacing in the freshly turned soil. Bones. Work halted within minutes. What had begun as an ordinary infrastructure job was about to transform into one of the most divisive archaeological sites in North America. Over the next 5 months, the rumble of heavy machinery was replaced by the slow, methodical scrape of trowels and brushes. Archaeologists carefully peeled back layers of fine, silty earth, uncovering an extraordinary collection of remains preserved within it. At first glance, the discovery seemed straightforward enough. The bones belonged to a Mastodon, one of the towering Ice Age giants that once thundered across the North American landscape before vanishing toward the close of the Pleistocene. But the routine quickly evaporated. Something about the bones was deeply, almost unsettlingly, wrong. They were not arranged the way a fallen animal's skeleton should be. They were broken, severely so, and not in the chaotic way bones tend to fracture under thousands of years of geological pressure. The damage looked patterned, intentional. The site would soon become known as the Cerutti Mastodon site, and the questions it raised would reverberate through archaeology for decades. As the dig progressed through the summer of 1992, the team began noticing details that grew harder and harder to explain through natural processes alone. The Mastodon skeleton was not just incomplete, it was selectively destroyed. The thickest, densest bones, the heavy femurs and limb shafts, had been smashed into fragments. Yet the lighter, far more delicate bones, the ribs and vertebrae, sat undisturbed and intact. The fragments themselves were not scattered randomly across the site. They were grouped, gathered into distinct clusters. Inside those clusters, archaeologists kept finding something else. Stones, 5 large, heavy cobbles of andesite. A dense volcanic rock formed when lava cools quickly into a fine, hard grain. In a fossil bed, an occasional rock is unremarkable, but these stones were different. Each weighed roughly 30 pounds. They sat directly inside the concentrations of shattered bone, and they were lying in fine silt, the kind of low-energy sediment that no ancient flood or rushing river could have carried those weights into. Something, or someone, had placed them there. As researchers studied the bones and stones together, the picture grew stranger still. The fractures showed a very particular signature. They were spiral fractures, the kind that only form when a bone is broken while still fresh, before fossilization sets in. There were percussion cones, small cone-shaped impact marks left when concentrated forces delivered to a single point. And there were bone flakes, sliver-thin pieces, struck cleanly off the larger bones in a way that closely mirrored the byproducts of ancient stone tool use. The andesite cobbles seemed to confirm the implication. Their surfaces were marked by abrasions, fractures, and impact damage, entirely consistent with use as hammerstones and anvils. In several cases, individual bone flakes and stone chips could be physically refitted, locked back into their parent pieces, recreating the exact moment of impact. The pattern was unmistakable. Some stones had been the strikers, others had served as platforms. To the research team, this was no accident of geology. It looked like the residue of an ancient act, one carried out with deliberate purpose. But why crush the heaviest bones while leaving the smaller ones untouched? The leading interpretation came down to one resource: marrow. The largest bones in a mastodon are dense reservoirs of fatty, calorie-rich tissue, precisely the kind of nutrition that early humans across the world prized. The thin ribs and vertebrae, by contrast, offered little reward and were ignored. This style of bone processing is not unusual. From Africa to Europe to Asia, sites stretching back hundreds of thousands of years show the same behavior, the same selective targeting of marrow-bearing bones using hammerstones and anvils. As a behavior, it was completely typical of early hominins. The problem was the location and, much more importantly, the timing. For most of the last century, the question of when humans first reached the Americas had a confident, well-defended answer. The Clovis culture, marked by its distinctive stone points, suggested an arrival near the tail end of the last ice age, somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago. That answer held firm for generations. Then, slowly, the evidence began to shift. Fossilized human footprints discovered at White Sands National Park were dated to roughly 22,000 years ago. Stone beads recovered from Santa Helena in Brazil hinted at a human presence reaching back perhaps 27,000 years. The picture grew older, more complex, more contested. But all of these dates, however surprising, still sat within a reasonable Ice Age window, the last 30,000 years or so. The Cerutti Mastodon site refused to play by those rules. Dating the site, however, proved enormously difficult. The bones had long since lost their original collagen, the organic component required for standard radiocarbon analysis. It would take decades and a far more advanced technique to pin down a definitive age. Scientists at the United States Geological Survey turned to uranium-thorium dating. The principle behind it is surprisingly intuitive. A buried bone behaves something like a slow mineral sponge. Over thousands of years, it absorbs trace amounts of uranium from the groundwater seeping through the soil around it. Once locked inside the bone, that uranium begins to decay at a steady, predictable rate, transforming into another element called thorium. By measuring the precise ratio between the two, much like reading the slow trickle of sand through an hourglass, researchers can calculate how long the bone has been buried. When the results came back, they stunned even the people who had been working on the site for years. The Cerutti remains were approximately 130,000 years old. If the interpretation of human involvement is correct, the consequences are staggering. The Americas would have been touched by hominin hands more than 100,000 years earlier than the established record allows. It would mean a migration, or perhaps a population, that we have no other archaeological signal of, no settlements, no clear tools, no skeletons. It would force a wholesale revision of one of the central narratives of human prehistory. Did some unknown wave of archaic humans reach North America during a previous interglacial warm period? Were they Neanderthals, Denisovans, an entirely different lineage that left no genetic descendants? Or is the entire scene simply a remarkable geological coincidence dressed up to look like ancient activity? The reaction from the scientific community was, predictably, intense. What is striking, though, is that the criticism rarely targets the date itself. Most experts accept that the bones are roughly 130,000 years old. The fight is over what those bones mean. Skeptics raise a long list of concerns. Could the heavy machinery from the 1992 highway work have caused the fractures? The research team responded by pointing to the ancient soil carbonates encrusted along the broken edges of the bones, mineral coatings that take many thousands of years to form. Whatever broke those bones broke them long before any backhoe arrived. But other objections are harder to wave away. There is the problem of the missing toolkit. At nearly every accepted lower Paleolithic site around the world, archaeologists find unmistakable evidence of crafted tools, hand axes, bifaces, scrapers, and blades shaped by clear human intention. At Cerutti, there is nothing of the kind, only the unmodified cobbles. There is also the silence of the bones themselves. If hominins were butchering a mastodon, critics argue, there should be cut marks, the fine microscopic striations left when stone edges slice through tissue against bone. None have been identified. The original research team has pushed back hard. They ran careful experimental tests using unmodified stones similar to the andesite cobbles, breaking elephant bones to replicate the process. The fracture patterns, percussion cones, and bone flakes that resulted matched the Cerutti material strikingly well. They have also pointed out what natural forces cannot explain. A violent flood sorts material by size and weight, tossing the heavy stones one way and the lighter fragments another. Yet at Cerutti, 30-pound cobbles and paper-thin bone flakes lie side by side in fine, undisturbed silt, exactly where they would settle after a single localized event. The skeptics counter that experimental replication only proves what is possible, not what actually happened. And so the debate continues, suspended between two utterly different versions of the past. Today, the Cerutti mastodon bones rest quietly in museum drawers, but the questions they carry refuse to settle. They may be the faintest possible echo of a forgotten chapter in human history, a vanished migration of archaic hominins who reached the Americas, briefly survived, and disappeared without leaving descendants or villages or tools we can recognize. Or they may be a perfect storm of natural processes, a cautionary tale about how cleverly the earth can imitate the work of human hands. Because if those bones really were broken by intelligent beings, then the story of humans in the Americas is not just missing a chapter. Its first page is written somewhere far deeper, far older, and far stranger than anyone has been willing to seriously imagine.